To think you know what medieval royalty looked like. Ivory towers, velvet gowns, noble kings choosing elegant queens. Think again, because behind the thrones, behind the tapestries and the stained glass windows was a world so brutal, so grotesque that even the word barbaric feels like an understatement. This isn't the fairy tale you were told. It's a nightmare you were never meant to hear. A 6-year-old girl, barely old enough to read, still playing with dolls, was handed over like a piece of meat at auctions to a 29-year-old king, desperate, paranoid, and spiraling into madness. Her name was Isabel of France, and the man she was forced to marry was Richard II of England. But this isn't just a creepy age gap story. It's a politically orchestrated trauma machine, one wrapped in gold leaf, sprinkled with incense, and paraded through Gothic cathedrals to make it all look holy. Isabel, dressed in layers of silk too heavy for her tiny frame, her eyes wide with confusion as grown men cheered. Richard, grinning with the emptiness of a man who'd already begun to crumble from the inside out. And what followed was a tale of manipulation, psychological torment, and yes, royal depravity that defies comprehension. You're about to hear the story that textbooks whitewash, that scholars downplay, that museums gloss over. The story of a royal union so disturbing, it makes Game of Thrones look like a bedtime lullaby. Because this is the unholy marriage of a terrified child and a decaying king. And it starts with a treaty soaked in desperation. Richard II wasn't just any monarch. He was a ticking time bomb on a golden throne. Crowned at the age of 10, he never learned to lead, only to demand, to punish, to surround himself with flatterers who feared his wrath more than God himself. By the time he reached his late 20s, rebellion was boiling beneath his crown. Nobles whispered, soldiers defected, peasants sharpened their pitchforks in secret. He needed an ally. He needed France. And France had a daughter. Isabel, 6 years old. The French king, Charles VI, known as Charles the Mad, saw an opportunity. He could offload a daughter and stall a war. Richard saw a chance to silence critics and paint himself as a peacemaker. But here's where it gets truly grotesque. Rather than seek a woman, Richard insisted on the child. He wanted someone untainted, obedient, pure, someone who wouldn't question him, someone who couldn't, and so the deal was struck. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but that marriage, it wasn't a ceremony, it was a public exhibition of trauma. The wedding took place in Calais, a city drenched in the stench of blood-soaked history. Isabel, so small she had to be carried, was dressed in fabrics that cost more than most men's lives. Eyewitnesses described the surreal horror of it. This doll-like girl draped in gold, her face blank with confusion as an adult king slid a ring onto her finger. He bent down to kiss her cheek, and the crowd cheered. Let that sink in. Thousands of nobles applauding while a 6-year-old was married to a 29-year-old man. But here's the truly horrifying part. It wasn't just political, it was personal. Richard, lonely, unstable, and desperate for control, kept Isabel near him constantly. He commissioned paintings of her, ordered custom dolls carved in her image. He spoke of her not like a father or a husband, but like a collector admiring a rare specimen. There are even accounts of him locking her in rooms so no one else could see her. His prize, his possession, his proof of power. Modern psychologists, looking back, suggest Richard exhibited signs of narcissistic personality disorder, possibly even delusions. But in medieval England, such things were just called royalty. And the madness didn't stop there, because Isabella's life became a theater of obedience. She was trained to curtsy at precise angles, to smile on command, to speak only when spoken to. Her diet, her tutors, her handmaidens, every inch of her world was controlled by a paranoid man teetering on the brink. And remember, she was 6. But wait, it gets worse. While Richard played house with a child bride, England rotted. The people starved. The nobles conspired. The kingdom frayed at the seams. And Richard, clutching his little queen like a talisman against chaos, descended further into delusion. He believed God had made him untouchable. He believed Isabel was proof of divine favor. He believed that his enemies were heretics. And so he lashed out, executing nobles in front of cheering mobs, seizing land, rewriting laws to centralize his power. Meanwhile, Isabel was paraded like a saint and silenced like a slave. She didn't speak English. She had no allies, no voice, just cold stone walls and whispered prayers in a language her new kingdom didn't understand. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but many at court began to fear Isabel might become a pawn for even darker purposes. Poisonings, bedchamber whispers, talk of heirs born of ritual rather than romance. Was Richard planning to wait until she reached womanhood? Or something worse? Here's where it gets truly disturbing. Richard began collecting omens around Isabel. He believed she brought luck. When she wore blue, crops were good. When she sneezed twice, enemies died. She was becoming a superstition, not a girl, not a queen, a symbol, and symbols can be broken. But symbols, especially royal ones, don't last long in a crumbling kingdom. Richard's enemies were gathering. The nobles had had enough of his paranoia, his extravagance, his obsession with divine right, and his child queen, who had become a grotesque metaphor for his delusions. And so, in a silent, calculated move, they struck. Henry Bolingbroke, a cousin to the king and son of the legendary John of Gaunt, returned from exile with an army and a plan. He swept through England like fire through parchment, town by town, castle by castle, until Richard had nowhere left to hide. And when they finally cornered him, what they found was not a mighty king, but a broken man, babbling in riddles, clinging to his tiny queen like a child clutches a toy for comfort. Isabel, now 7, was ripped from his arms by armed men. She screamed. He wept. The king who once ruled with an iron fist now sobbed like a child, begging them not to hurt his little angel. But England had spoken. Richard was deposed. Henry took the throne as Henry IV. And Isabel was sent to the Tower. Let that sink in. A 7-year-old girl imprisoned in the Tower of London. You don't learn this in school, but for over a year, she was kept under heavy guard, treated as a dangerous political asset, a foreign pawn who could reignite war with France if misused. She had no family, no home, no language, just stone walls, cold food, and the ghosts of the condemned whispering through the night. And here's where it gets even worse. France demanded her return, not for her safety, but for leverage. She was a diplomatic chip, a bargaining piece on a chessboard of blood and betrayal. When she was finally released and brought back to Paris, she was 9, but the trauma had done its work. Gone was the innocent girl draped in gold silks. In her place stood a child who did not speak, who flinched at sudden sounds, who refused to eat unless it was tested for poison. Charles VI, the Mad King of France, and her father barely recognized her, and he didn't care because now it was time to marry her off again. But here's where it gets truly nauseating. The French court debated whether she could be remarried so soon. Some argued she was still legally wed to Richard, who after being imprisoned, had mysteriously died in captivity. Some said she needed time to mature, but the powerful didn't care. She was a means to an end, and the end was control. Eventually, she was married off, this time to her cousin Charles, Duke of Orleans. She was 11. He was 16, and while the marriage was, by medieval standards, less grotesque, the damage was already done. She had become a woman shaped by silence, molded by obedience, stitched together by trauma. She bore no children. She spoke little, and by the age of 19, she was dead, cause unknown. But those close to her said she had been ill for months, coughing blood, wasting away. Others claim she simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped being, because when your life begins as a ceremony of violation, and every step thereafter is paved with betrayal, sometimes death is the only escape that feels like freedom. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but Isabel D's story is buried beneath royal records and political justifications. She is remembered, if at all, as a footnote, child bride of Richard II. But behind that label is a girl who never got to be a child. A girl whose name was used to stall wars and decorate crowns. A girl who was photographed. If she lived today, her image would go viral, sparking outrage. But in her time, she was cheered for being married at 6, her suffering sanctified, her silence mistaken for grace. Let's not sugarcoat this. Let's call it what it was. A state-sponsored, publicly celebrated abuse of power, wrapped in pageantry, justified by treaties, endorsed by kings. Because medieval politics wasn't just brutal, it was a theater of cruelty dressed as divine order, and girls like Isabel, they were the sacrificial lambs. But here's the final horror, the one that lingers long after the last candle burns out. Richard's body, after his mysterious death in captivity, was put on public display to prove he was truly dead. They dressed him in royal finery, propped him up like a wax figure, and made Isabel walk past his corpse. As nobles whispered that she had cursed him, that she was the omen, the bad luck charm, the foreign witch who had brought the king to ruin. At just 9 years old, she was blamed for the fall of a monarch, blamed for surviving, and the image of a little girl in mourning robes, forced to stand before the rotting body of the man she was once forced to call husband, that is the image that should haunt every cathedral where their wedding bells once rang. So there you have it. Not a tale of noble alliances or romantic unions. No, this is the anatomy of a political transaction, dressed up in gold-threaded robes and soaked in the tears of a child. But don't look away just yet. Because the nightmare of Isabel was not unique. It was part of a pattern of monarchy's darkest obsession, controlling female bodies to maintain power. In the medieval world, daughters weren't daughters. They were contracts with legs, and Isabel was one of many. Consider Margaret of Valois, married off at 17 into a political death trap, or Catherine of Valois, forced into a marriage with England's Henry V, only to become a pawn for inheritance wars that would rip the kingdom apart. But Isabel? She was the worst of them all, because she had no agency, no choice, and no future. Let that sit for a moment. A 6-year-old girl, yoked to a man nearly 5 times her age, paraded for cheers, imprisoned for politics, repackaged for a second marriage before she could even understand the first. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but the grandeur of medieval kingship was often built on the bones of voiceless girls. The chronicles talk about kings and their wars, alliances and treaties, but they gloss over the screams muffled by velvet drapes. They hide the small coffins under the heavy stones of cathedrals. They don't write about the silences that followed these child marriages, the kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from suppression. And here's where the final punch lands. Richard II, once glorified as a peace-seeking king, has statues. His tomb is in Westminster Abbey. Visitors shuffle past, reading plaques that speak of diplomacy, vision, divinely ordained leadership. But where is Isabel's tomb? Where is her monument? Where is the statue that tells the world, here lies a child torn apart by crown and court? There isn't one, because her story wasn't meant to be remembered. It was meant to be erased, to be absorbed into the narrative of necessary politics and dynastic duty. But we remember, and you should too, because behind every gilded crown, every marble statue, every stained glass saint, there are stories like Isabel's, stories that don't make it into history books because they don't flatter kings. Stories that get lost unless someone dares to speak them out loud. So what do you think? Was Isabel simply a victim of her time? Or was this something more, a sanctioned horror that reveals the rot at the heart of royal power? Maybe both. And if these disturbing royal facts made you question everything you thought you knew about monarchy, maybe hit that subscribe button, because we've only just begun to peel back the silk curtain. There are more horrors waiting, more forgotten voices buried beneath the palaces, and trust me, you haven't heard anything yet. Let's rewind for one final moment, not to relive the details, but to remember the weight of what they mean. A child, barely taller than a knight's sword, stripped of her innocence before she even knew what it meant to be innocent. A king, clinging to the illusion of control, binding himself to purity because he feared his own decay. A kingdom, applauding the ceremony not for love, but for leverage, for treaties, for land. This wasn't a one-off horror story. It was policy, it was tradition, and perhaps worst of all, it was accepted. When the wedding was announced, nobles celebrated, merchants threw coins in the streets, clergy preached that it was God's will. No one stopped to ask what the girl wanted. No one paused to wonder what it meant for her soul, her mind, her body. Because when power is the only God worth serving, every child becomes a potential sacrifice. You don't learn this in history classes out there, but even among those closest to the royal court, there were whispers. Private doubts scribbled in diaries, murmurs passed over goblets of wine. Some said Richard was unwell. Some said Isabel should have been sent back immediately, but no one acted, because to act was to risk losing favor, and in royal courts, favor was oxygen. Without it, you suffocated, so the silence continued. Isabel remained a wife in name, a political relic in reality, a living contradiction wrapped in lace and shame. She smiled on command, curtsied when told, nodded, wept, stood, and sat according to rules written not for her, but about her. And when her short, tragic life ended at 19, they said she died peacefully. But peace is not the absence of pain. Peace is justice. Peace is being seen. And Isabel was never seen, not truly. Her face painted in court murals, her name inked in genealogies, but her voice never heard. So let this script be her voice. Let it echo in places where royal names are still worshipped, where monarchy is still romanticized, where fairy tales still end with royal weddings as if that's the dream. Because sometimes that wedding is the nightmare. If you've stayed with me this long, then maybe now you see the truth. Not the truth in textbooks, not the truth in gilded biographies, but the raw, horrible human truth. That power can be crueler than any sword, that history can be complicit in trauma, and that even the smallest among us, like a 6-year-old girl forced into a crown, deserve to be remembered not as props in someone else's drama, but as people, real breathing, hurting people. So when you hear the name Richard II again, don't just remember the deposition, the war, the fall of a king. Remember the child he called his queen. Remember Isabel, because forgetting her, that's exactly how it all happens again.